I feel your frustration. You want a story that feels alive, not a script that sounds like it was copied and pasted from a template. You want the raw emotion, the cinematic detail, and a plot that actually moves you, without the mother calling 3 years ago cliché. Let's burn the old script. Let's start a brand new journey right now. No more phone calls. No more holiday rejections. This is about stolen credit, a hidden legacy, and the moment a shadow finally steps into the sun. Part 1, The Ghost in the Glass. My name is Aria, and I'm 30 years old. 2 hours ago, my older sister, Victoria, stood on a stage at the city's most prestigious architecture gala and accepted the Visionary of the Year award for a building she didn't design, using a philosophy she doesn't understand. She looked at the crowd, her diamonds catching the light of 100 cameras, and said 5 words that turned my blood to ice. I dreamt this up alone. I was standing in the wings of the stage, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain that smelled of old dust and stage makeup. My hands were rough, the skin at the tips of my fingers, calloused from months of gripping drafting, pens and carving scale models, out of balsa wood. I was wearing a black catering uniform, the only way I could sneak into the event to see my own work unveiled. The crowd erupted in a standing ovation. In the front row, my mother, Susan, was weeping with pride. She looked at Victoria as if she were a miracle. She didn't look toward the shadows where I stood. She never did. "Aria, be realistic," my mother had whispered to me 6 months ago, her voice cold as she looked at my sketches spread across the kitchen table. Victoria has the presence. She has the degree from the school we could actually afford to send her to. If the firm is going to survive, she has to be the face. You're just the support. You should be happy your designs are being built at all. I tasted the bitterness of the cheap, lukewarm coffee I'd been drinking for 72 hours to finish the blueprints Victoria had presented to the board. After the ceremony, I met them in the private lounge. The sound of clinking champagne, glasses, and the low hum of wealthy laughter filled the room. "Aria, there you are," Victoria beamed, her eyes darting to my uniform with a flash of embarrassment. She handed me her empty crystal flute without looking at me. "The governor wants a signed lithograph of my master plan. Make sure you have it ready by 6, and don't smudge the ink. This one is going in a museum." I looked at my father, David. He was standing by the window, staring out at the city skyline, a skyline now dominated by a building I had poured my soul into. He knew the truth. He had seen the blisters on my hands. He had heard me crying at 3 a.m. when the math on the cantilever wouldn't balance. "It's for the family name." "Honey," he said, his voice a hollow, passive shadow of the man he used to be. "Think of the legacy." He turned his back to me to pour Victoria another drink. I walked out of the gala and into the biting night air. The city smelled of rain on pavement and distant wood smoke. I didn't go to the celebration party. I went back to the archives, a damp, cramped basement room in the firm's old building where I was allowed to work. I sat at my desk, the only light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. I reached for my charcoal, but my hand hit a heavy, iron-bound trunk that had been moved into the corner during the office renovation. It belonged to my grandfather, the man who started the firm before. Victoria turned it into a marketing machine. I took a heavy drafting tool and pried the lock open. Inside, beneath layers of yellowed vellum, I found a leather-bound journal. I opened it to the final page, dated the day he died. There was a letter addressed to me, not to Victoria, not to my mother, but to the quiet one. Attached to the letter was a legal deed. It wasn't for the firm. It was for the intellectual property of the very foundation the firm was built on. My grandfather hadn't left the company to my mother. He had placed the entire creative catalog into a trust that only the lead designer could own. By claiming my designs as her own tonight, Victoria hadn't just stolen my credit. She had inadvertently triggered a legal clause that made me the majority owner of every single asset the family possessed. Something inside me went quiet. The shaking in my hand stopped. I looked at the Visionary trophy Victoria had left on my desk to be cleaned. I didn't clean it. I picked up my pen and began to write a single short email. The morning after the gala didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a funeral for the girl I used to be. I sat in the basement studio at 5:30 a.m., the air smelling of stale coffee and the sharp, acidic scent of ink. The silence of the building was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic thud-thud of the HVAC system overhead. I watched the sun bleed a bruised purple over the skyline, catching the glass of the Victoria Tower, the building I had designed in this very basement while my sister was being fitted for silk gowns. I pulled a dusty box from under my desk. It was filled with the pattern. I sifted through old sketchbooks from when I was 7. There was a drawing of a garden, vibrant, detailed, perspective perfect. Across the top in my mother's elegant handwriting, it said, Victoria's Garden, age 9. I was 5. I had spent 3 days on that drawing, only for Linda to tell me that Victoria needs the encouragement more than you do. Aria, you're naturally gifted. She has to work for it. Then there was the high school science fair project. I had built a bridge model out of balsa wood that could hold 50 pounds. Victoria had forgotten to do hers. My father, James, had looked at me with those tired, passive eyes and whispered, just let her put her name on it. Aria, it'll help her get into a better college. You'll always have your talent. The pattern was a slow erosion. Each time they took a piece of my work, they took a piece of my identity, until I was nothing but a ghost haunting my own life. The office door upstairs clicked open. I heard the sharp, rhythmic clack, clack, clack of Victoria's heels. It was a sound that usually made my stomach do a nervous flip. The sound of a command about to be given. Aria! Her voice echoed down the stairs, bright and brittle. Where is that lithograph? The governor's assistant is calling in 20 minutes. She appeared at the bottom of the stairs, looking radiant in a cream-colored power suit, smelling of expensive white florals. She looked around the cramped, windowless room with a faint expression of disgust, as if the very air of my labor was beneath her. I didn't finish it, I said. My voice was low, rasping from the lack of sleep. Victoria stopped. She actually laughed a short, sharp sound. Excuse me? Aria, this isn't the time for one of your creative moods. The firm's reputation is on the line. My reputation. The firm's reputation is built on my hands. Victoria, I said, finally looking up. I watched her face. The mask of the visionary slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing the cold, calculating woman underneath. She stepped closer, the scent of her perfume suddenly suffocating in the small space. Don't start this, she hissed, her voice dropping an octave. You know how this works. You get the quiet life, the steady paycheck, and the freedom to draw. I handle the world. You couldn't survive 10 minutes in a boardroom, and we both know it. Now give me the prints. I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the fear behind her eyes. She knew she was a fraud. She knew that without my mind, she was just an empty suit in a designer chair. Mom and Dad are coming in for the press conference at noon, she continued, regaining her composure. Try to look presentable. And for heaven's sake, wash the charcoal off your hands. It's embarrassing. She turned and marched back up the stairs. I sat in the silence she left behind. I looked at the legal deed I had found in my grandfather's trunk. He had seen the pattern too. He knew that one day, the visionary would try to swallow the creator whole. I thought about my father. I thought about the thousands of times he had stayed, silent while my mother redistributed my achievements like they were common property. He wasn't the villain, but his silence had been the cage I lived in. I reached for my phone and checked my sent folder. The email I had sent to the firm's board of directors and the primary investors was sitting there, a digital ticking clock. I had attached one thing, the time-stamped, original digital files of the Victoria Tower blueprints, dated 3 months before Victoria had even conceived the idea. The shadows on the floor were stretching now, the sun climbing higher. My father had a chance to choose me 1,000 times over the last 20 years. And every single time he chose silence. Something in me didn't break. It solidified. Like the steel beams I designed. I was learning that I could carry an immense weight without snapping. But I was done carrying theirs. The press conference was set for noon in the glass-walled atrium of the firm's headquarters. Usually this was where I would hide in the background, holding Victoria's coat or checking the lighting. But today I stayed in the basement. By 11 a.m., the building was vibrating with the energy of a major event. I could hear the footsteps overhead, a frantic, rhythmic drumming of interns and caterers. The smell of roasted coffee and expensive catering pastries drifted down the vents, mocking my empty stomach. I sat at my desk, my fingers tracing the jagged edge of a scale model. I'd broken in a fit of exhaustion months ago. Then the silence of the basement was shattered. The heavy steel door swung open so hard it hit the brick wall with a deafening clang. My mother stood there. She wasn't the polished socialite from the gala. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide with a cold, predatory fury. Behind her stood my father, James, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. What have you done? Linda's voice wasn't a whisper. It was a lash. I didn't stand up. I stayed in my chair, the cold metal biting into my spine. I sent the truth, Mom. The truth? She stepped into the room, her heels crunching on the stray pieces of balsa wood and charcoal dust. You sent a lie to the investors. They're calling an emergency meeting. Victoria is upstairs in tears. The governor is asking questions. And you're sitting here in this filth trying to ruin your sister? I'm not ruining her, I said, my voice sounding hollow and strange in my own ears. I'm just stopping her from using my name. Your name? Linda laughed, a jagged, ugly sound. You don't have a name in this industry, Arya. You have a job because we gave it to you. You have a roof over your head because we allow it. You're a ghost. You're the help. I looked at my father. He was staring at a pile of discarded blueprints in the corner, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. Dad? I asked. Do you think I'm just the help? He finally looked at me. His eyes were watery, filled with a crushing, pathetic sort of pity. Arya, honey, you've always been so sensitive. You know how Victoria is. She needs the spotlight. We thought you were happy here. Why would you do this to the family? Why now when we're so close to the top? Because the top is built on my back, Dad, and I'm tired of carrying it. You're ungrateful, Linda hissed. She reached across my desk and grabbed my sketchbook, the one with the original concepts for the tower. You think you're so smart? Without the family name, you're nothing. Effective immediately, you're fired. Get your things. You have 1 hour to vacate this studio and the apartment we pay for. She didn't wait for a response. She turned and marched out. My father lingered for a second. He reached out as if to touch my shoulder, then saw the look in my eyes and pulled back. He followed her, the heavy door clicking shut behind them. The silence that followed was absolute. I sat there as the clock ticked toward noon. I heard the muffled roar of the crowd upstairs as the press conference began, the applause, for the sister who had just fired me. I was 30 years old, and in the span of 5 minutes, I had lost my job, my home, and the only people I had ever called family. I packed a single bag. I didn't take the expensive drafting tools they had bought for me. I took my grandfather's journal, my charcoal pencils, and a small, framed photo of myself. As a child, before the light, and my eyes had been dimmed by their shadows. I walked out the back entrance. It was raining, a cold, stinging drizzle that tasted of soot and iron. I stood on the sidewalk, my bag over my shoulder, watching the limousines line up at the front of the building. I had nowhere to go. No friends. They had all been family friends who took Victoria's side. No savings. My allowance had been barely enough for rent and supplies. I walked until my shoes were soaked through, my feet numb against the pavement. I ended up at a 24-hour diner on the edge of the industrial district. The air inside smelled of burnt grease and cheap floor cleaner. I sat in a vinyl booth, the tears finally coming. Not loud, just a steady, silent leak that blurred the neon sign in the window. I pulled out my phone to turn it off, to disappear. But there was a notification. Not from my family, not from an investor. It was an email from a small, boutique architecture firm I had contacted months ago under a pseudonym, sharing some of my private sketches. These designs have a soul we haven't seen in decades. We don't care who you are. We want to see more. Come to this address tonight. We're having a late-night workshop. There's a seat for you. I looked at the address. It was 6 blocks away. I grabbed my coat. If I was going to be a ghost, I was going to be one that haunted them from a place of my own making. I didn't have a family dinner to go to. I didn't have a home. But for the first time in my life, I had a direction. The address led me to an old textile warehouse on the fringe of the city, a place where the brick was worn smooth by a century of wind, and the windows were tall, soot-stained arches. I stood outside the heavy iron door, my bag heavy on my shoulder, the rain dripping from the hem of my coat. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my chest. I almost turned back. The voice of my mother whispered in my ear, "You're a ghost. You're the help." I pushed the door. It wasn't locked. Instead of the cold, sterile marble of my family's firm, I walked into a cavernous space bathed in a warm amber glow. The air didn't smell of ego and expensive perfume. It smelled of fresh sawdust, roasted coffee, and old books. String lights were draped haphazardly across low-hanging rafters, and the sound of soft, soulful jazz hummed in the background, punctuated by the rhythmic scritch-scratch of pencils on paper. A woman with a shock of silver hair and eyes that looked like they had seen everything and judged none of it looked up from a large wooden trestle table. This was Eleanor. "You look like you've walked through a storm," she said, her voice like warm honey. She didn't ask for my resume. She didn't ask who my father was. She simply pulled out a chair, a sturdy, mismatched wooden chair near the heater. "We saved you a seat. Get dry. The coffee is fresh." I sat down, my hands trembling as I reached for the ceramic mug she offered. The warmth of the coffee seethed through the clay, thawing my frozen fingers. I took a sip. It tasted of real cream and cinnamon, the taste of a home. I had never actually lived in. "I'm Aria," I whispered. "I know," a man said, stepping out from behind a stack of architectural models. This was Richard. He was steady, with a quiet strength in his shoulders and a pair of spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He didn't look at me with the pity my father did. He looked at me with curiosity. "We've been studying those sketches you sent. The way you handle light, it's not just math. It's a conversation." In the corner, a man about my age was bent over a drafting board, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up, and for the first time in years, I saw a look of genuine welcome in a stranger's eyes. This was Marcus. "The girl who designed the Victoria Tower anonymously," Marcus said, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. I recognized the hand. "I've been trying to figure out how you stabilize that south-facing cantilever for weeks. It's brilliant. And it's a crime that your name isn't on the cornerstone." I looked down at my coffee. "My name isn't on anything?" "Names can be changed," Eleanor said softly, leaning against the table. "Identity isn't what people say about you, Aria. It's what you refuse to let them take. Tonight we aren't working for clients. We're working for the sake of the craft. Join us." I stayed for 6 hours. We didn't talk about my mother's fury or Victoria's theft. We talked about the soul of structures. We talked about how a window isn't just a hole in a wall, but a frame for a human life. Richard showed me how to work with reclaimed timber, and Marcus helped me refine a sketch for a library I'd dreamt of since I was 10. For the first time, I wasn't a support. I wasn't the messy one. I was a peer. As the clock ticked toward 4 a.m., the workshop began to wind down. The jazz had faded to a low, comforting hum. I looked at my hands. They were still stained with charcoal, but for the first time, the stains didn't feel like filth. They felt like a badge of honor. "Where are you staying tonight, Aria?" Richard asked, his voice low and protective, but not overbearing. I looked at my single bag sitting by the door. I'm still figuring that out. Eleanor and Richard exchanged a look, a silent, seasoned communication between two people who had built a life together. "The loft upstairs is empty," Eleanor said, placing a warm hand on my shoulder. The touch was light, but it felt like an anchor. "It's quiet, it has a view of the river, and the locks are very, very strong. Stay as long as you need. We could use someone with your eye around here anyway." I looked around the warm, glowing warehouse. Outside, the world was still cold, and my family was likely still celebrating their stolen victory in their ivory tower. But inside this room, surrounded by strangers who saw me clearer than my own blood ever had, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in decades. I felt safe. "Thank you," I said, my voice finally finding its strength. As I climbed the wooden stairs to the loft, I heard Marcus call out, "See you at breakfast!" "Aria, Richard makes the best sourdough in the city." I closed the door to the loft. It was a simple space, exposed brick, a comfortable bed, and a large window looking out at the bridge. I watched the rain turn into a soft mist over the water. My family thought they had cast me out into the dark. They didn't realize they had actually let me out of my cage. The first week in the warehouse felt like learning to breathe in a different atmosphere. At my parents' house, the air was always thin, pressurized by expectations and the constant need to remain invisible. Here, the air was thick with the scent of Richard's toasted sourdough and the earthy, grounding aroma of wet clay from Eleanor's pottery wheel in the back. I woke up every morning to the sound of soft footsteps below, not the sharp, demanding clack of Victoria's heels, but a rhythmic, purposeful movement that felt like a heartbeat. "Breakfast is on the table, Aria. Don't let the eggs go cold or Richard will take it personally," Eleanor would call out. I would walk down the wooden stairs, my heart still braced for a critique, for a reminder of my messiness. Instead, I found a seat saved for me, a literal seat. Richard would push a plate of eggs and golden toast toward me, and Marcus would already be deep into a blueprint, his coffee steaming beside him. I was thinking about your library sketch, Marcus said one Tuesday morning, his eyes bright. He pushed a piece of vellum toward me. The way you use the atrium to funnel natural light into the basement levels, it's brave. But what if we used dichroic glass? It would change the color of the hall based on the time of day. It would make the building feel like it's breathing. I stared at the drawing. He wasn't telling me what to do. He was inviting me to play. It would be expensive, I whispered, the old voice of my mother reminding me that my ideas were always too much. Quality usually is, Richard said, not looking up from his newspaper, but with a firm nod. We don't build boxes here, Arya. We build legacies. If the light needs to change, we find a way to make it change. Slowly, the tension in my shoulders began to dissolve. The quiet suffering that had been my constant companion for 30 years started to feel like a heavy coat. I was finally allowed to take off. I began to work in the studio during the day. Eleanor noticed the way I would flinch when someone walked behind me, or how I would instinctively cover my sketches when a door opened. One afternoon, she sat down next to me, her silver hair catching the afternoon sun. "You're waiting for the blow, aren't you?" she asked gently. I didn't answer. I just stared at the charcoal smudge on my thumb. "In this house," Eleanor continued, "we don't take things that don't belong to us. And we don't belittle the hands that create. Your talent isn't a threat to us, Arya. It's a gift. You don't have to hide anymore." She reached out and squeezed my hand. Her skin was warm and rough from her own work, a stark contrast to my mother's soft, pampered palms that had only ever held a drink or a checkbook. That touch did more to heal me than 1,000 apologies ever could. By the second week, I stopped checking my phone for messages from my family. I knew what was happening in their world. I saw the headlines. Victoria Miller's masterpiece under scrutiny, internal, conflicts at Miller & Associates. The investors were circling. The legal email I had sent was a slow-acting poison in their system. But for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel like I was ruining the family. I felt like I was finally letting the truth have its day in the sun. The most profound change, however, was in my daily life. I started to take walks along the river with Marcus. We didn't talk about architecture. We talked about our favorite books, the way the water looked like hammered silver under the moonlight, and why he chose to work with Eleanor and Richard instead of a big firm. "They saved me," Marcus admitted one evening as we stood on the bridge, the wind biting at our cheeks. "I was at a firm in Chicago. They wanted me to cut corners on low-income housing. I refused. They blacklisted me. Richard found me at a dive bar sketching on napkins. He told me he had a seat for me. He looked at me then, his eyes soft and steady. 'You're not a ghost, Arya. You're the most vivid person I've ever met. I see you. We all see you.' He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His fingers were warm against my skin, a gentle, lingering touch that made my breath catch. It wasn't a demand. It was an acknowledgement. That night, I went back to the loft and looked at my reflection in the window. The girl looking back didn't look like a placeholder anymore. She looked like someone who was starting to belong to herself. The healing wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow integration into a new kind of family, one built on trust, warmth, and the simple, revolutionary act of being seen. I was no longer an acceptable sacrifice. I was becoming the architect of my own life. The transition from survival to living happened in the quiet spaces, between the blueprints. By the third month, the warehouse didn't just feel like a refuge. It felt like the center of the world. The ghost who used to haunt the basements of Miller & Associates was fading, replaced by a woman who laughed at the dinner table and dared to keep her head up when she walked through the city. The bond with Marcus deepened in the way a sturdy structure is built, one brick at a time, founded on a bedrock of mutual respect. We began to share a desk, our sketches often bleeding into one. Another's, I would draw the skeleton of a building, and he would breathe life into the interiors. We spoke a language of light, shadows, and shared silence. "You're doing that thing again," Marcus whispered one evening. We were hunched over a model for a community center, the only light in the studio coming from our shared desk lamp. "What thing?" I asked, my charcoal pencil paused over a courtyard design. "Holding your breath when you get to the difficult parts, as if you're afraid the whole thing will collapse if you exhale." He reached over, his hand covering mine on the drafting table. His skin was warm, a steadying weight. "Let it out, Arya. The building is strong. You made it that way." I exhaled, a long, shaky breath that had been trapped in my lungs for years. I turned my hand over, interlacing my fingers with his. The touch wasn't just romantic. It was a permanent anchor. In his eyes, I didn't see the reflection of a helper or a disappointment. I saw a woman who was capable of creating wonders. I've never been chosen first for anything, Marcus, I admitted, my voice barely a thread in the quiet room. I've always been the backup plan. Then let this be the first of many times, he said, leaning in. The kiss was soft, tasting of the peppermint tea we'd been sharing and the sweet promise of a future, where I wasn't an afterthought. It was a kiss that said, I see you and I'm staying. Outside our bubble of safety, the storm of my old life was reaching a fever pitch. Victoria had tried to sue for defamation when the board of directors froze her accounts. But the time-stamped digital files I had sent were an undeniable trail of breadcrumbs. The visionary was being unmasked, and the public's fascination with the falling star was relentless. One afternoon, a courier arrived at the warehouse. He handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope. I recognized the stationery immediately. My mother's personal monogram. Inside was a letter, but not an apology. Arya, enough of this childish tantrum. Your father is unwell with the stress. And Victoria's career is in tatters because of your selfishness. If you drop the claims and sign a statement saying there was a clerical error regarding the blueprints, we will increase your trust allowance and let you come home. Don't throw away your family for the sake of pride. I looked at the letter, then at the window. Downstairs, Richard was showing Marcus a new technique for joist suspension, and Eleanor was humming a jazz tune while she worked her clay. The smell of fresh bread was rising from the kitchen. I didn't feel the familiar pang of guilt. I didn't feel the urge to run back and fix their mess. I felt a strange, detached pity. They were still living in a house of cards, trying to convince me that the wind was my fault. Bad news? Marcus asked, coming up the stairs and noticing the envelope in my hand. No, I said, crumpling the expensive paper into a ball and tossing it into the recycling bin. Just a ghost from a house I don't live in anymore. I walked over to him and leaned my head against his chest. I could hear his heart, steady, reliable, and beating for me. The joy I felt wasn't loud or boastful. It was a quiet, deep-rooted safety. I was learning that the joy of the summer wasn't just in the sunshine or the work. It was in the permanence of my new life. One evening, after a long day of poring over site plans for the new community center, Eleanor called me into the library, a room that smelled of old leather, vanilla, and the wisdom of 1,000 books. Richard was there, sitting in his favorite worn armchair, a single golden lamp illuminating the space. He looked up and smiled, but his expression was more serious than usual. Arya, Eleanor began, sitting beside me and taking my hand. Her touch was steady, the warmth of it seeping into my skin. We've been a team for a long time, but Richard and I, we never had children of our own. We spent our lives building structures, but we realized recently that a structure is empty without a legacy to fill it. Richard cleared his throat, leaning forward. We've seen what you've built here. Not just the drawings, but the person you've become. We know about the struggle with your biological family. We know they made you feel like you were an acceptable sacrifice. He paused, his eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, protective light. We want to make it official, Arya. We've spoken to our attorneys. We'd like to offer you an adult adoption. We want you to be our daughter, legally and permanently. Everything we've built, this firm, this home, our name, it should belong to someone who honors the craft as much as we do. I couldn't speak. The silence in the room was thick with a kind of love I had never dared to imagine. For 31 years, I had been an afterthought. Now these two people, who had no obligation to me, no shared DNA, were offering to make me their own. You don't have to answer now, Eleanor whispered, squeezing my hand. I don't need time, I said, my voice cracking. Yes, 1,000 times yes. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of legal papers and quiet celebrations. But amidst the joy of my new legal family, Marcus was planning a commitment of his own. On a quiet night on the warehouse roof, under a canopy of stars that felt close enough to touch, he knelt on the gravel and asked me to be his wife. I want to choose you every day for the rest of my life, he said, the ring glinting in the moonlight. No shadows, just us. I said yes, but as we began to plan the wedding, a small, intimate ceremony in the warehouse garden, a shadow did begin to creep back in. The news from my biological family was getting worse. Their firm was bankrupt. Victoria's designs had been flagged for structural inconsistencies, and the investors were suing for millions. My mother began to send letters, not apologies, demands. Arya, stop this nonsense. You're destroying us. Come home and sign the affidavit saying you were just a consultant. It's your duty as a miller. I didn't reply. I didn't even open the last 3 envelopes. I placed them in a drawer, the weight of my past feeling heavy against the lightness of my future. As the wedding date approached, the fear of their arrival grew. I had spent my life shrinking to fit their needs. Now I was terrified that their presence would force me to shrink again. I stood in front of the mirror in my wedding dress, a simple, elegant silk that felt like a second skin, and saw the woman I had become. They can't take this from you, Eleanor said, appearing behind me and adjusting the veil. You aren't the girl in the basement anymore. Arya, you are the architect of this family now. I looked at the invitation list. 100 names of people who loved me. Not a single miller was on it. But as I smelled the fresh-cut jasmine for my bouquet, I had a realization. True boundaries aren't just about who you lock out. They're about how much of yourself you let stay free. The morning of the wedding, the warehouse garden was transformed. It smelled of crushed mint, damp earth, and the hundreds of white peonies Eleanor had spent weeks cultivating. The air was still, save for the distant, rhythmic hum of the river, and the light was a soft, golden amber that felt like a blessing. I stood in the library, the silk of my dress cool against my skin. My hands weren't trembling. For the first time in my life, facing a major event, I felt a profound, unshakable calm. Then I heard it. The sound of tires screeching against the gravel driveway, the heavy thud of a car door. And then the voice, sharp, demanding, and utterly out of place in this sanctuary. I don't care if there's a ceremony. I am her mother. I didn't wait for Richard to intervene. I didn't hide. I walked out of the library, through the workshop, and into the sun-drenched foyer. There they were. Linda, looking haggard despite her designer coat. Victoria, her face tight with a desperate manic energy. And my father, James, trailing behind them like a ghost. They looked like gray stains on a beautiful canvas. Arya, Linda hissed, stepping toward me. She didn't look at my dress. She didn't look at the joy in my eyes. She looked at me like a piece of property that had gone missing. You are going to end this. Now. Victoria's career is in ruins because of that trust clause you triggered. You're going to sign the papers we brought. And you're going to tell the press it was all a misunderstanding. No, I said. The word was small, but it carried the weight of 31 years. No? Victoria stepped forward, her voice rising to a shriek. Look at this place, Arya. A dusty warehouse? Strangers? You're a miller. You belong in the city, in the firm. Do you have any idea what you've done to our reputation? I didn't do anything to your reputation. Victoria, I said, my voice steady. My gaze locked on hers. I simply stopped providing the talent you used to build it. You're not a visionary. You're a thief who forgot that the person you were stealing from was human. I looked at my father. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He was staring at a pile of sawdust on the workshop floor. Dad, I said. He flinched. You knew. You watched them erase me for decades. You had every chance to stand up for me, and you chose to be comfortable instead. Arya, please, he whispered, his voice cracking. It's family. No, I replied, and I felt Eleanor and Richard step up behind me. Their presence a warm, solid wall of support. This is family. The people who saw me when I was invisible. The people who gave me a name when you were busy taking mine away. I reached into the pocket of my silk wrap and pulled out a small notarized document. Not the one they wanted. These are the papers of my adult adoption, I said, placing them on the table between us. As of 3 weeks ago, I am legally the daughter of Eleanor and Richard. I am no longer a miller. I am an heir to this firm. And I am the sole owner of the intellectual property of the tower. If you ever contact me again, or if you ever use a single sketch of mine for your business, my lawyers will finish what the investors started. The silence that followed was absolute. I saw the moment the power shifted. I saw the moment Linda realized she had no leverage. I saw the moment Victoria realized she was truly alone in her fraud. Get out, Richard said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was the voice of a man who protected his home. They left. No dramatic exit, just a slow, defeated retreat to their expensive car. I watched them drive away until the dust settled back onto the gravel. I turned to Eleanor and Richard. My eyes were wet, but my heart was light. I'm ready now, I whispered. I walked down the aisle to Marcus. The music was a soft, acoustic melody, and the faces in the crowd were the people who had actually shown up for my life. When Marcus took my hand, his grip was firm and warm. "You did it," he whispered. "I'm free," I replied. As we exchanged vows, the smell of the jasmine was overwhelming, and the taste of the champagne for the toast was sweet, not bitter. I wasn't the acceptable sacrifice anymore. I was the bride. I was the architect. I was the daughter, and for the first time, I was completely, undeniably whole. The weeks following the wedding felt like the quiet, golden hours after a massive fever has finally broken. The warehouse, once a sanctuary of healing, was now a place of thriving creation. The Miller name had officially vanished from my ID, replaced by a legacy I had earned through grit and the grace of those who chose me. I sat in the loft one morning, the sun casting long, warm rectangles across the brick floor. Beside me sat a stack of letters. For the first time, I felt no dread as I looked at them. They weren't demands. They were the final echoes of a dying world. I opened a letter from my father. It was written on plain paper, no longer embossed with the family crest. "Arya, I watched the footage of the community center opening on the news. They mentioned your name, your new name. You looked happy. I realize now that my silence was a weight you should never have had to carry. I am living in a small apartment now. The house is gone. Your mother and Victoria aren't speaking to me. I suppose I finally have the quiet I always pretended to want. I am sorry I didn't choose you when it mattered." I didn't cry. I felt a strange, detached pity for the man who had let his life be swallowed by the shadows of others. I folded the letter and placed it in a box. I didn't need to carry his guilt anymore. Closure, I realized, wasn't about getting an apology. It was about no longer needing one to feel whole. Downstairs, the workshop was buzzing. We had just landed the contract for the city's new sustainable library, the one I had dreamt of as a child. Marcus was at the drafting table, his brow furrowed in that familiar way, while Eleanor and Richard were arguing, playfully over the type of stone to use for the courtyard. I walked down the stairs, the scent of fresh pine and old books wrapping around me like a hug. "The library committee called?" Richard said, his eyes twinkling behind his spectacles. "They want the architect to lead the first site visit." He called me that now. Not the girl, not the assistant, just the architect. The aftermath of my departure had been devastating for Miller and Associates. Without my designs to sustain them, the firm had collapsed under the weight of its own emptiness. Victoria had taken a job in real estate in another state, far from the industry she had tried to conquer with stolen wings. My mother was embroiled in a never-ending cycle of litigation. They were gone from my daily life, reduced to cautionary tales I no longer felt the need to tell. But the most beautiful part of the aftermath was the new life, beginning within our own walls. A few months into our marriage, Marcus and I stood in the garden, the air smelling of the first frost and wood smoke. I took his hand and placed it against my stomach. "I want our child to grow up in a house where the walls are made of truth," I whispered. Marcus pulled me close, his chin resting on the top of my head. "They will. They'll never have to shrink to fit into a room. Arya, we'll build rooms that are big enough for everything they are." Healing wasn't a destination. It was the way we lived now. It was the way Eleanor taught me to prune the roses so they would grow back stronger. It was the way Richard stood by the door every evening to welcome us home. It was the peace that came from knowing that even if the world tried to dim my light again, I had a family that would stand in the dark with me until the sun came back up. I looked at the blueprints for the library spread out on the table. My name was in the bottom right corner. It wasn't just a label. It was a promise. The library opened on a Tuesday in late autumn. The air was crisp, smelling of fallen leaves and the distant, familiar scent of the river. As I stood in the center of the atrium, I watched the light filter through the dichroic glass Marcus and I had fought so hard for. The walls shifted from a deep, bruised violet to a warm, hopeful amber as the sun moved across the sky. The building was breathing. I looked down at the cornerstone. It didn't say Miller. It bore the name I had chosen, the name of the people who had built a seat for me when I was wandering in the rain. Beside me, Eleanor and Richard stood with their arms linked, looking at the structure with the quiet pride of people who knew they had left the world better than they found it. Marcus held our daughter, little Alara, against his shoulder. She reached out a small, chubby hand to touch the smooth grain of a reclaimed oak pillar, the same wood I had spent years learning to restore. I realized then that my core wound, the feeling of being an acceptable sacrifice, had finally closed. It hadn't healed because I became successful or because my biological family lost everything. It healed because I stopped asking for permission to exist. I stopped waiting for people who were blind to my value to suddenly gain sight. Strength isn't about how much you can endure in silence. It's about the courage to walk away from a table where love is served in scraps. I looked around the library, filled with students, dreamers, and families. I had built a space where everyone was welcome, where no one was underfoot, and where the light reached every corner, even the basement. I am Aria. I am a daughter, a wife, a mother, and an architect. I am no longer a ghost. I am the one who holds the pen. If you're watching this and you've been the scapegoat of your family, if you've been told you're too much or too sensitive, or always causing drama just because you dared to ask to be treated fairly, I want you to know something. It's not you. It never was. You deserve to be chosen, not as a backup, not as a last resort, not as the acceptable sacrifice when someone else's comfort is at stake. Chosen first. Chosen fully. Chosen without conditions. Family isn't blood. Family is an obligation. Family isn't people who share your DNA but treat you like a burden. Family is the people who show up. The people who see you crying alone and invite you to their table. The people who open their hearts and their homes and make you officially, permanently, undeniably theirs. I spent 30 years trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. And then I spent 3 years learning what love actually looks like. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. It helps more people find these stories when they need them most. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to set boundaries with your own family? Share your experience in the comments. I read every single one. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love knowing how far this story reaches. And if you want more stories like this, check the description. I've linked some of my favorites there. Until next time, remember, you deserve to be chosen.